1 year since one of the darkest days in Maryland's history.
The whole bridge just collapsed.
The Francis Scott Key Bridge collapsed into the Patapsco River after the Dali cargo ship ran into it in the early morning hours of March 26, 2024, killing 6 people.
Y el momento que me dieron la noticia no lo creía.
I'm going in depth on the tragedy as we hear from victims' families and the dive team members who helped search for their loved ones.
How do you recover somebody?
You don't let go.
Plus, we examine what has changed in the years since the Key Bridge collapse.
Thank you for joining us for this week's edition of Fox 45 News in Depth. I'm Mackenzie Frost. It's been more than 1 year since Baltimore's Francis Scott Key Bridge was struck by the Dali cargo ship and collapsed into the Patapsco River. And the lead up to the 1 year mark of the tragedy, state and federal leaders went back and forth about who should be held responsible. The National Transportation Safety Board recently released its findings following a months-long investigation. The NTSB argues the state of Maryland could have prevented the bridge collapse, saying officials failed to conduct a vulnerability assessment on the bridge. Chair Jennifer Homendy says if the Maryland Transportation Authority had properly assessed the bridge in the years before, the collapse could have been mitigated as well as the risk.
Had they ran the calculation on the Francis Scott Key Bridge, the MDTA would have been aware that the bridge was almost 30 times greater than the risk threshold.
Just days after the NTSB pointed fingers at the state of Maryland, Governor Wes Moore was asked about the bridge collapse on Fox News Sunday. The governor shifted the blame away from the state, arguing the Dali cargo ship was solely responsible.
It was the sole fault of the Dali and the sole fault of the reckless operators.
A spokesperson for Synergy Marine, one of the companies that owns the Dali, released a statement on these latest developments, saying they extend their deepest sympathy to those impacted by the collapse and appreciate the update from the NTSB. But they will not be making further comment due to ongoing investigations. Let's take a look at how we got here. Just before 1:30 in the morning on March 26, 2024, the cargo ship Dali hit the Key Bridge, sending it falling into the Patapsco River in a matter of seconds. 8 people were on the bridge at the time. 6 of them were killed. The Port of Baltimore was temporarily closed as crews began a months-long cleanup operation. Less than 3 months later, the port reopened after crews were able to demolish most of the bridge and bring the Dali back to the port. In February of this year, Governor Wes Moore revealed the new design for the Key Bridge, completed by Kiewit Infrastructure. We'll take a closer look at that design and how it will be funded a little later in our show. Fox 45's Jessica Babb was at the site of the bridge collapse yesterday as Governor Moore and other leaders spoke about progress over the past year and honored victims. Jessica, what did the governor have to say?
Mackenzie, he spent time obviously honoring the victims who lost their lives, but he also reflected on the progress that's been made with the cleanup and the efforts to rebuild the bridge. But I also pressed him on the NTSB's recent announcement saying the collapse could have been prevented with risk assessments that weren't done on the Key Bridge and have only recently been started on the Bay Bridge. So I asked him why.
Every single year, there's federal estimates and federal analysis about our bridges and our roads and our tunnels, and every single year, the Key Bridge has passed those analyses. The reason that we had to have a memorial today is not because of an NTSB report. The reason we had to have a memorial today is not because of a report that NTSB put out in 1991 or another report in 2009. The reason that we had to have a memorial today and had to memorialize 6 Marylanders who we lost is because of reckless operators who should have never authorized that bridge, to authorize that ship to go out.
Again, not giving us a direct answer to that question. I then followed up asking if the lack of vulnerability assessments showed the state could have done more, but he once again pointed to the Dali as a key reason for the collapse. I also pressed him if he's concerned about the Bay Bridge and if more preventative measures will be put in place. He said the state will continue investing in infrastructure.
All right, Jessica, so you also spoke with the families of the victims. 1 year later, how are they doing?
Well, they are still struggling with the loss of their loved ones, as you can imagine. I talked with the wives of Miguel Angel Luna and Menor Yasir Suazo Sandoval. They say this really has marked them forever, especially since it took weeks for some of those men to be found after the bridge collapsed. I asked Bertalia, Menor's wife, when it set in that her husband wasn't coming home.
I really can't tell you because time just dragged on.
Incluso todavía hay momentos en los que piensa.
And there are times, even now, that I think
Que un día él va a volver.
that one day he'll come back.
Él nunca esperó que nunca más volvería a casa.
Because it was never expected that he would never return home.
Yo nunca imaginé
I never imagined
que esa tarde iba a ser la última vez que lo iba a abrazar.
that afternoon would be the last time I would embrace him,
Que le iba a decir un te amo.
to tell him I love you.
Porque teníamos planes
Because we had plans,
como todo mundo.
like any other couple.
Absolutely heartbreaking, Jessica, and you can, those wives speaking with a translator there. So how do they want their husbands to be remembered moving forward?
Both women said their husbands were great men, fathers, husbands, sons, community members. They were hard workers, simply trying to provide for their families. Miguel had dreams of starting a restaurant with his wife. Now Maria, his wife, tells me she's working to accomplish that dream in her husband's memory. And all of the victims were loved and revered in the community.
Era el mejor esposo
My husband was the best husband
que Dios me pudo permitir.
that God would allow me to have.
Compartí con él 14 años.
I shared with him 14 years of my life.
Era un hombre muy inteligente,
He was a very intelligent man
muy entregado a su familia.
and really dedicated to his family.
And the families of the 6 construction workers killed in the bridge collapse have come out in support of the governor's stance, holding the Dolly's owners responsible. In a statement, they say, in part of the past year of investigation, it confirms the Dolly's crew were negligent, and they want to hold the Dolly's owners and operators accountable for their role in the tragedy.
Jessica Babb, thank you so much for that incredibly powerful interviews and just heart-wrenching to hear. Thank you. The Baltimore City Fire Dive Team spent days searching for the victims following the bridge collapse. I joined the team on a recent training session to hear about their experience.
Harbor rescue alarm.
I was at home and pager went off.
Fire rescue boat 1, fire rescue boat 2, dive team coordinator.
And I got some phone calls
4900 block of I-695.
stating that the Key Bridge had collapsed.
Be advised, the entire bridge, the entire Key Bridge is in the harbor.
What was it like for you when you showed up on the scene?
The first action was we were gathering information.
At this point, did you know how many cars had gone over or how many people were potentially in the water?
No, I got there about 2:30 a.m.
Dispatch the dive unit, will alert the dive team.
So we were on the Fort Armistead side.
Dive coordinator, I'm en route.
We went out to the site on the DNR boat and we did what's called a battlefield sketch.
The body camera video from the Maryland Department of Natural Resources shows that moment. Patrick Hurley describes getting the first glimpse of the catastrophic scene. At 2:36 in the morning, the magnitude of the crisis on display.
It was still pretty chaotic.
Once the Baltimore City Fire Dive Team got a plan together, it was go time.
What was the debris field like?
I'll tell you, one of the creepiest things we heard actually was the sound of the steel still moving. It kind of just big, loud, hollow, kind of chunky sound that we all were just very aware that this was like, something really surreal. There were still lights from some of the emergency vehicles that had gone under that you could see the glow coming up through the water.
Before the sun came up on March 26th, the water of the Patapsco River was frigid.
The water wants to turn to ice but can't.
But it wasn't the biggest obstacle for the dive team. The road thousands of people once drove over without thinking much about was pulverized.
As soon as you went subsurface, it became almost pitch black. That fine concrete powder and the asphalt would just come up and envelop you.
While underwater, the team navigated through rebar, trying not to get snagged.
We came across a mile marker sign on the actual pole on my way down, so that gave us like an idea of roughly where we were on the bridge.
Hurley snagged on a vehicle that had plunged into the river.
I marked it with a buoy, sent it up, and then I got pulled from the water.
Captain Kathy actually made contact with the red truck, and he was the first one to make contact with the targets that were inside the red truck.
The information that we gathered as a team from the Unified Command, the videos, that we were able to find a good dive site, and we were able to isolate our search area so that we could really try to find the trucks and the victims that we were looking for.
Captain Clark Cathy and the rest of the team rely on their training to excel in high-stress situations. Like the collapse of the Key Bridge.
How we act on an actual incident is the same as how we train.
And that's what this team is doing right now.
What do you got?
Suiting up, swimming laps, and diving underwater to ensure when crisis calls, they're ready. At the bottom of the pool,
try putting the loop in your thumb. Yeah, like that.
Captain Cathy works with another dive team member to practice searching for a target.
Target acquired. Divers leaving the bottom. Divers on the surface.
While the pool is light today, they know the real-life situation is likely a lot darker.
How would you describe this scene under the water and what you were able to see and fight through?
Close your eyes. Seriously, close your eyes. Please.
Right now?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Now imagine yourself 40 feet underwater, and it's so cold, and now reach out in front of you, and you're not touching anything, and you don't know where you are, and you don't have no idea what you're going to touch. You're going to touch a car, you're going to touch a bridge, you're going to touch metal, or you're going to touch a person.
How do you recover somebody?
You don't let go.
1 year later, this team still thinks about the collapse, especially the 6 construction workers who were killed.
You know, they were just trying to feed their families, trying to make an honest living.
Being able to have a hand in returning those men to their families makes the difficult dives worth every moment.
Our job is to return that family member so that that family can have closure. So that becomes our mission.
Push it.
Which is why a training day like this
Go. Turn. Let's go, Rich, let's go! Push!
is mission critical.
The citizens of Baltimore should understand that if something happens inside the water and something happens where they go subsurface, they've got 20 individuals that are highly trained and highly motivated to try to do everything in their power to save their life.
I also spoke with Baltimore City Fire Chief James Wallace about how his department responded to the incident. He talked about the strategic decisions his team had to make to try and find any survivors. And in those first 20 minutes, did you think that we still didn't really know how many people we were looking for, right?
Right, no, we didn't. We can speculate, but we don't do that. We look at it as though, in that particular incident, as though we have people in the water. We have to get out there safely, but we also have to get out there effectively, right? We have to be strategic in how we deploy our resources, and the mission remains the same. They go out, they assess that situation, they do real quick looks for any obvious survivors, and then they begin to try to process what's going on, where is this going to evolve to.
First responders were able to rescue 2 survivors in the hours following the collapse. Chief Wallace says it was the kind of operation that required cooperation from local, state, and federal responders.
So, obviously a scene, it was a very large scene, well over a mile worth of area that we have to deal with. When you have an incident scene that's that big and your mission has different components to it, meaning there was a rescue mission there, there was potentially an environmental concern there were other issues. That incident has to scale up, right? We force multiplied like resources, so divers, boat capability, sonar capability, air resources.
Chief Wallace also told me the loss of the bridge had an emotional impact as the reality of the tragedy set in.
You know, even responding that night, from areas of the city where you would always be able to see the Key Bridge, you couldn't see it while responding. You could not see that, you know, kind of that outline, and you know, even on a dark skyline, there's enough lights around the marine terminals. You would always see it, the flashing lights. I think the reality, for me, that the skyline for the city of Baltimore, a real defining structure in the city of Baltimore, was gone. And it would just being able to see it from a distance, just the reality really began to set in.
I want to thank the Baltimore City Fire Dive Team and Chief Wallace for letting us in for one of their training sessions and sharing their experience. Still to come, rebuilding the Key Bridge could cost more than planned. How the Trump administration could impact the project with federal funding hanging in the balance. Reconstruction plans for the Key Bridge are already underway. The MDTA released some renderings of the new bridge, which the governor says will honor the former bridge's architectural tradition, but will see design and safety upgrades. Leaders say some pre-construction work on the new bridge has already begun, but portions of the Key Bridge are still in place in the Patapsco River, with demolition slated for this spring. Congress passed a spending bill in December, which included 100% federal funding to replace the Key Bridge. But President Donald Trump has repeatedly threatened to pull government funds from states opposing his administration's policies. That has some Republican lawmakers in Maryland warning Governor Moore about his rhetoric surrounding President Trump.
Certainly not a recommendation from us to criticize the Trump administration when you're relying so heavily on funding that comes from them, especially on big projects like the Key Bridge. I think I liked it before when the governor said he was willing to work across the aisle and work with the new administration. I think I would advise him a little bit more to maybe change that attitude, and let's see if we can work together with this new administration.
State officials hope to have the new bridge completed by October 2028. Maryland still has full federal funding for now, but the cost to rebuild the bridge might end up exceeding earlier estimates. When Congress passed its spending bill with funding for the bridge, it was believed the bridge would cost around $2 billion to complete. But an expert we spoke with says the Trump administration's new 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum could prove costly.
Last year, when this bill was passed, it looked like it was going to cost about $2 billion to rebuild this bridge. But if you add on these tariffs, I mean, we're talking about 25% to 30% tariffs on aluminum and steel. And listen, this bridge is going to be mostly steel. So I think that this bridge could cost at least 25% more than the $2 billion number. And that's being optimistic.
In the aftermath of the Key Bridge collapse, the Port Administration tells Fox 45 News the port had its second best year ever, handling nearly 46 million tons of cargo, with more than half of that in the last 6 months of the year. It came after a record year in 2023 with 52.3 million tons of cargo moving through the port. But officials also say the port has not fully recovered and might have even broken the 2023's record if the bridge had not collapsed. Experts estimate the port lost $192 million for every day it was closed. It was shuttered for months, impacting businesses and port workers. 6 months ago, the president of the International Longshoremen's Association told me he's grateful to state leaders for keeping workers financially afloat.
It was a tough time. It was an uncertain time, but the governor gave me his word that he was going to come through, and he did. So, and the Senate President and Senator Salling, and they're good people, right? They're always looking out for the port. The port's the economic engine for the state. It's a driver. It's millions of dollars a day come through that port. So it's important to everybody.
Beyond the port, the bridge collapse also significantly impacted traffic in and around Baltimore, and drivers are still feeling the impact 1 year later. According to the Maryland Transportation Authority, in fall of 2024, months after the collapse, the Fort McHenry Tunnel's average daily traffic volumes increased 15% compared to averages in fall of 2022 and 2023. The Harbor Tunnel saw a 7% increase in average daily traffic during that same time period compared to the prior 2 years. Travel times have also gotten longer since the bridge collapsed, with the MDTA reporting increases of 15 minutes during workday morning rush hour through both tunnels and 20 minutes or more during weekday evening rush hour. As for other routes, the MDTA says it's still working out updating the 2024 traffic volume, so it doesn't have 2024 data for most of 695. But the agency did provide us with numbers from its automated traffic counter on 695 just south of the Cove Road overpass in Dundalk, near where the Key Bridge used to stand. The counter shows traffic dropped from an average of around 36,000 vehicles per day in the fall of 23 to a little less than 26,000 vehicles per day in the fall of 24. A new study from Johns Hopkins University reveals the likelihood of bridges across the United States being hit by cargo ships and claims if the Key Bridge was still standing, it would be among the 10 most vulnerable bridges in the country. Researchers predicted a ship would hit the Key Bridge within 48 years. It was 46 years old when it collapsed. The study also finds the Chesapeake Bay Bridge is one of the several across the country likely to sustain a catastrophic hit in the future. Researchers say the Bay Bridge is at risk of a collision once every 86 years. The bridge is currently 73 years old.
What that means is that there's a significant risk on an annual basis that a collision will occur, like what happened with the Key Bridge. And as a result, protective measures really should be put in place.
You can find the full study right now on the Fox 45 News app. Some of the Dolly crew still has not gone home after more than a year. After the break, we'll take a closer look at some of the lawsuits the ship's owners are facing in the aftermath of the collapse.
Here's tonight's primetime lineup on Fox 45. Brought to you locally by your McDonald's owner-operators.
One year after the Key Bridge collapse, some of the Dolly's crew members are still here in Baltimore. They remain as part of the ongoing legal battles to hold the owners and operators of the Dolly accountable for the collapse. Andrew Middleton, the director of Apostleship of the Sea, has met with the crew to help them process the tragedy.
I purposely have never asked the crew about the incident, and I don't think anyone, set sail with the intention of causing damage or loss of life. They mourn, the loss of life as well.
Grace Ocean Private and Synergy Marine, the owners and operators of the Dolly, are facing dozens of lawsuits in the wake of the collapse. Just days after the tragedy, the companies asked a federal judge to limit their liability to the value of the ship and its cargo, around $43 million. Months later, the Department of Justice reached a settlement with the owners of the Dolly, requiring them to pay more than $100 million to cover the federal costs of restoring access to the Port of Baltimore. That decision came after an investigation found electrical failures and the crew's inexperience contributed to the collision. Other parties suing the ship's owners include a man who survived the collapse, the families and employer of the 6 victims, the Longshoremen's Union, the City of Baltimore, and the state of Maryland. We'll continue to follow all of those pending lawsuits, which could take years to resolve. That's all for this week's edition of Fox 45 News in Depth. I'm Mackenzie Frost.